Hi, this is Paul, and I want to continue taking a look at Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Brett Weinstein in what I call Vancouver 1. We're going to talk about Darwinian rationality and rational morality. Obviously, Sam Harris is interested in promoting rational morality as opposed to religious morality or spiritual. Well, he might say spiritual's okay because I think he fudges and redefines spirituality. Now, where we left off was Jordan Peterson, where he says he's going to do this little aside and he wants to talk about Jane Goodall. And as I mentioned in the previous video, Peterson is working his process, just pretty much following along, right on track. And when he takes this aside, the whole conversation is going to go in a different direction. And you'll see why in a minute. So let's hear him do it.
Okay, so another thing that I wanted to just point out obliquely, and then I want to return to outlining maybe where we agree is...
And you're not going to get back. You're going into Mirkwood, and you're not going to be able... Sam isn't going to be able to stay on the path. Sam's going to get into the stream. Sam's going to get taken by elves. It's going to be a mess.
One of the things that was really shocking to me, I would say, was my reading of what was originally Jane Goodall's discovery about chimp behavior, because there was this idea that was really rooted in Rousseauian thinking that the reason that people committed atrocities in the service of their group identity, let's say their tribal identity, was because culture had corrupted us. So it was a uniquely human thing. But then, of course, Goodall showed in the 1970s that the chimps at Gombe, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, yep, would go on raiding parties, right? And so there'd be like 4 or 5 adolescent chimps, usually male, sometimes with a female in there. They would patrol the borders of their territory. If they found an interloper on the border, near the border, from another troop, even if it was a member of their troop that had emigrated, so to speak, and that they had some history with, they would tear them to pieces. And of course that was shocking to Goodall, and my understanding is she had some trepidations about publishing it, although she did. But then that's been noted repeatedly in other forms of chimp behavior. So, see, I've been really interested in the commission of atrocity in the service of belief. And it's tempting to pin that, say, on dogma and then to associate that with religious dogma. I think that's all tempting. But the fact that chimps do it shows that it can't be a consequence of something like religious belief, unless you're willing to say that the reason that chimps commit atrocity in the service of their troop and their territory is because chimps are religious. And so they're not religious, and they don't really hold a secular totalitarian viewpoint, but they still act out the atrocity element that's characteristic of human behavior. And so to me, that makes the problem deeper than one of mere, let's say, surface statements about metaphysics.
Well, obviously the problem of primate aggression, which we've inherited along with the chimps, is deeper, or at least different, than the problem of religious violence or totalitarian political structures.
Okay, now notice, deeper or different. Well, okay, so if the real problem that you have, Sam, is with religious stuff, what about this problem over here? Now, what Peterson's trying to do is an argument he does often. When you hear him talk about inequality, he'll say the Pareto distribution. And what he says is that inequality is built into the universe at a far deeper and lower level before it gets into culture, so therefore you can't remediate it at this level when it's way down here. This is the argument Peterson is making, and he actually uses forms of arguments like this in many different places and in many different ways. And so he's basically telling Sam Harris, you've got all these issues with religious dogma, but there's something going on way, way earlier that probably is fueling religious dogma. And Sam Harris isn't going to deny that. He'll say that in a moment, but let's see where it goes.
Okay, get the worst out of people.
So there's another agreement. So Peterson's continuing to make his way here through. He's sticking to the path.
So, I mean, we have these primate capacities that we have to correct for, and we're busily trying to correct for.
And we're going to talk about that. We have these primate capacities we're trying to correct for. Here's the question: who's we? What is the person? What is the Is it free will? Is it the person inside our heads? Who's we that are trying to correct for this? Because aren't we the products of this? But now keep paying attention. Is Sam going to stick to the path?
Almost everything that we've been evolved to do. I mean, we don't like the state of nature for good reason.
Now, what you'll also notice is that right now he's separated humanity from nature, which is a very interesting thing, given that he is a naturalist, and we are all simply the products of nature. And this is where, in a number of my videos back, I go into the point that naturalists have a really hard time sticking to this. And right here, Sam breaks the canon. He breaks the rules of naturalism, because what other thing, go back to C.S. Lewis and Miracles, naturalism says the whole show. Everything that happens is a product of the whole show. Now, where is this new space that is not a product of the whole show that we are deciding to do? You've got free will in there. You've got agency in there. Right at this moment, Sam breaks canon, but doesn't even notice.
And virtually everything that's good about human life is born of our, I would argue, culture-based and highly intelligent and necessary effort to mitigate what is in fact natural for us.
So I would argue culture-based, highly intelligent, mitigate what is natural. Read C.S. Lewis's Miracles. He is following C.S. Lewis 70 years later, because C.S. Lewis says nature is the whole show. That's what the naturalists say. There is no God. There is nothing outside of nature. It is just nature. It's all there is. And Harris just put fingers in there, separated it, and said there's this other capacity we have, which is intelligence, it's morality, and I would say, Sam, say the word. Say it, Sam. Say it. Rationality. You want to say it. You're thinking it. You're meaning it. Rationality comes and colonizes nature and improves it and makes it submit to the will of the reasoning person. And that reasoning person in that moment steps out of nature, and the rules, which is morality, the rules change. And you'll hear Brett Weinstein say this. You will hear Sam Harris say this. And you might say, now pause. Have you given up on the whole show? Have you given up on materialism? Have you given up on naturalism? Where does this extra nature, above nature, outside of nature thing come from? Again, read Miracles. C.S. Lewis walks through this thing one step at a time.
And there's nothing more natural than tribal violence, which of the sort that you're describing.
We're still on the path. We're not off yet.
Okay, so then it also seems like we agree that the core element of tribal alliance, which would have its roots, say, in the chimpanzee proclivity to, or its analog in the chimpanzee proclivity to identify with the dominance hierarchy of the troop, is something that's a source of the proclivity for human social aggression that's independent of its, at least independent of any obvious religious substrate.
See, Peterson's very disciplined. He is, who's more rational? Peterson is very rational. He's following his chain of argumentation one step at a time. Wait and see what Sam does.
There are other reasons for group belief and the commission of atrocity that can't be directly attributed to religious dogma.
Yeah, but I mean, and what most worries me about religion, I would say, I mean, obviously religion can channel these primate urges.
Here's the transition.
In unhappy ways, so you can get...
Okay, Jordan. Yeah, religion can appropriate this tribal stuff and channel it in unhappy ways.
Violence that gets amplified by religious dogmatism, and that...
Amplified.
Should trouble everyone.
That should trouble everyone.
But it's not unique to religion. It's also nationalism, and it's racism, and it's all...
Oh, there's other isms. It's not just religion. And in fact, I'm starting to read a book by Alan Jacobs, his latest book, Year of Our Lord, 1946, or 43, I don't remember which is the title, but it's basically during World War II, everyone is trying to figure out, well, everyone is saying, right now, Sam Harris says, religion is the problem. Well, in 1943, guess what the problem was? Nationalism. Nationalism is the problem. And because you're in the middle of the Second World War and all these nations, and that's exactly how the alignments are. And so we have to somehow evolve beyond nationalism. And so far, I'm really enjoying Alan Jacobs' book.
Other kinds of dogmatism. But what most worries me are those cases where clearly good people who are not necessarily captured by tribalism per se, are doing the unthinkable based purely on religious doctrines that they believe wholeheartedly without good evidence.
Blink, we're in the water. We're in the water, in the stream, in the middle of Mirkwood. We have touched the water, and Sam has now gone off the path. And you might ask, Sam, what does this have to do with what we were talking about? You're just changing the subject, and you're just, we're talking about Jane Goodall and all of these things, and we're going along the path, and Jordan is putting his blocks together and putting together his argument, and Sam stops and says, oh, but people converting to ISIS and becoming rationalized on YouTube and going to Syria and fighting. Is that connected somehow? Can you show us the connection? Or is this just you've been watching Jordan build the blocks and you just push them away and say, let's talk about ISIS? Okay, well, let's go back to where Jordan was going. Now, okay. Sam began by saying, the problem is religious dogma. That's our problem. And Brett Weinstein backed him down and said, but isn't the problem dogma that you can't update? And Sam says, yeah, I guess that's it. And then Jordan Peterson goes and says, yeah, but this whole business about logos and Christianity, they put at the top of the pyramid, the top of the hierarchy, the ability to converse about this. And that's why, yeah, we agreed on that too. So we've already agreed on these points, but we're going to forget them now, and we're going to talk about ISIS. Well, let's go back and, okay. So the problem is religious dogma, even though basically just before, you've already given up on those things, but you're back to them. Belief and assertions without sufficient evidence, especially when people claim these dogmas have supernatural origins. Okay. Jordan Peterson says, now, wait a minute. Okay. So you're protesting tyranny and violence and the kinds of what we call barbarity. Look up the origin of that word. Get back to the Greeks. That happened, that people do to one another. And Peterson says, now wait a minute, this is before religion. Chimps do this. And when Jane Goodall went out, she saw this. Chimps tear each other apart for reasons that don't seem to correlate to religion. We inherit violence, right? This is this nature that Sam Harris just began saying, yeah, this is something that we want to get beyond. And again, okay, wait a minute. Naturalism, the whole show, where is this space outside of nature that you're trying to lead us to, Sam? Well, let's talk a little bit about Jane Goodall. I'm about Jordan Peterson's age. And I remember as a young person watching Jane Goodall, on TV. And it made for great television. I mean, here's this lovely young woman out there living with the chimps and writing about them, and she's got this lovely voice, and it's very idyllic. And the business about chimp violence isn't only shocking. I think part of it is shocking because, in a sense, what made Jane Goodall and her work so compelling was, as Peterson said, the Rousseauian idealism of it all. And don't forget, this was happening at a time when this hippie generation is emerging, and we should be about nature, and we've been corrupted by civilization and society and human culture, and so if we can only get back to nature, then everything will be grand. And so this picture, I'll just go to Google image search, Jane Goodall, chimps, and boom, and just look at this picture. It is, this picture expresses Not simply, here's a woman and a chimp, two objects in space, but there's a story here, Sam. This is what images do. You can cruise over to Wikipedia. In contrast with the peaceful and affectionate behavior she observed, Goodall found an aggressive side to chimpanzee nature at the Gombe stream. She discovered that the chimps will systematically hunt and eat smaller primates, such as colobus monkeys. Goodall watched a hunting group isolate the colobus monkey high in the tree, blocking all possible exits. Then the chimpanzee climbed up and captured and killed the colobus. The others each took parts of the carcass, sharing with other members of the troop in response to begging behavior. Well, this doesn't sound very nice. The chimps that Gombe kill and eat as much as 1/3 of the colobus population in the park each year. They eat a lot of monkeys. This alone was a major scientific find which challenged previous conceptions of chimpanzee diet and behavior. Well, we thought they'd be nice vegetarians, not hurt the other animals. Not like mean old us. But perhaps more startling and disturbing was the tendency for aggression and violence within the chimpanzee group. Goodall observed dominant females deliberately killing the young of other females in the troop to maintain their dominance. Baby killing. Sometimes going as far as cannibalism, killing the babies and eating them. She says of this revelation, during the first 10 years of the study, I believed that the Gombe chimpanzees were, for the most part, rather nicer than human beings. Why would you think that? Only a person who grew up someplace far away, buffered from nature by hundreds of years of human development, would believe something like that nature is not red in tooth and claw. Then suddenly we find the chimpanzees could be brutal, that they, like us, had a darker side to their nature. Here we're back to this nature word. This is their nature. Now we, with our rationality, want to transcend it. And again, this is exactly C.S. Lewis's argument in his book Miracles. Her findings revolutionized contemporary knowledge of chimpanzee behavior and were further evidence of the social similarities between humans and chimpanzees, albeit in a much darker manner. And you can cruise over to Encyclopedia Britannica and look at territorial behavior. Well, why? Where is this from? And if you know anything about animals, well, animals are territorial, but why are they territorial? Well, they're territorial for, well, we would say for reasons. That we'd say their territoriality is rational. But now let's pay attention to some groupings. One of the things that chimps are paying attention to is chimp and non-chimp. Chimps are distinguishing between threats and opportunities. They're not keeping the little monkeys that they eat out. They want them there. They want their food supply handy, and they want them fresh. A little bit of work to kill, unlike when we pull out the meat from the fridge. Chimps are also observing family and non-family. Even if there's a biological connection, as Peterson mentioned, chimps are still paying attention to this. Food and not food, it's important. Reproduction. Females are paying attention to this. They're taking out their competitors. Is any of this irrational? No, it's perfectly rational. Threat and non-threat. So a snake comes in. What do they do with the snake? Flee from it or kill it? Is this rational? What is rationality? Would we say that these groupings are rational? Now, territoriality, I'm sitting here in my office. I am the power and principality in this little room to a certain degree. Now, I don't own this little room. The church owns this little room. But for the most part, I decide what's in this little room. I manage this little room. This is my room. When Jordan Peterson says clean your room, it's territoriality. We're getting this. And it's rational that chimps and rational that human beings practice territory because, as a chimp would tell you, failing to manage their territory could mean death. We don't just let anyone into our homes. We practice governance over this. We practice lordship over this. We practice, our rooms are our principalities. That's what we do with this. Now, Peterson rightly names Rousseau here with nature and morality. But right away, okay, once we say those two words together, nature and morality, we're already starting to feel the tensions of the gulf that Sam Harris burst open, and Brett Weinstein often does when it talks about things like transcending nature. You've already created that gulf that C.S. Lewis points out in his book Miracles. Now, Rousseau was a Calvinist. Hey, I can't take credit or blame for all the Calvinists out there. There are many kinds of Calvinists, many kinds of stripes, many kinds of belief. But you've got, from Calvinism, in terms of their interpretive scheme of the Bible, this primeval goodness and a fall. Well, I'm not sure exactly how that worked out in Rousseau. I'm not an expert on Rousseau by any means. Charles Taylor, however, in the secular age, talks about how, in general, many of these stories take certain forms. Many human mythologies have a golden age that is lost. So the story of humanity is one of corruption, and we're always trying to get back to these golden ages. Every time you go into Costco and you see packages with the word organic plastered on it, there's a tiny, looking at microaggressions, this is a micro-religiosity. There's a tiny bit of religion in there that before we had chemical fertilizers, we lived in a golden age where we weren't messing up the nitrogen cycle. And we didn't have pesticides on it that was messing up our system. So organic, all natural, tiny little bit of religion embedded in those words. Or is the human story a story to recover the golden age, or one of, now this is more the Darwinian story, one of progressive evolution where we are going from these nasty chimpanzees and we're trying to evolve beyond it. So here's the difficulty that Sam has, that even when he breaks open that little word and says, well, there's nature and then there's this, and it's like, you just gave up the game again, Sam, but I know you don't know it. So you might read a little C.S. Lewis and figure out that you've broken it up. But now you've got another religious system here. And you might say, well, this isn't religious because I have evidence for it. Okay. Well, you and I have a slightly different definition of religious. This is a globalizing story where somehow we progress, and yes, it's a story, we progress beyond chimpanzees to use reason to arrive at a higher stage. There's so much mythology built into that, the geography of it, and again, he and Lewis are a lot alike because Lewis is saying reason colonizes nature. But Sam Harris, as Lewis mentions again and again, can't stick to the materialist script because it can't be stuck to. Now, then Harris tries to continue with his moral map. But how different are these issues? Well, there's my group and not my group. Sam Harris couldn't protest this violence if he didn't already have a grouping in mind. Sam Harris, well, he gave up vegetarianism when, I forget who he was talking to, but, so we differentiate ourselves from the animals. We differentiate ourselves from the plants. We differentiate ourselves from other things. And what is the criteria for that differentiation? Well, Sam Harris is a humanist, and his entire moral system is, in a sense, premised on humanism. Well, what do I mean by humanism in this case? Because there's a bunch of different humanisms. I mean privileging human beings over other plants and animals, and definitely machines and other things. And paying attention to things like human suffering. This is what Sam Harris is all about. Well, Sam, where do you get this distinction? Now, I would say this distinction comes from Christianity, the Imago Dei. He's downstream from it. This is what he's inherited. Now, someone might yell, genetic fallacy. You should look up the genetic fallacy. Because the genetic fallacy says, just because it came down the stream doesn't mean it's good. That's true. I agree with that. Just because it came down the stream doesn't mean it's good. But Sam is denying that it came down the stream or that he got it from the stream. Well, now we're going to have to ask the question, Sam, where do you get this distinction? You are protesting the fact that chimps aren't observing chimp morality. Because if chimps were to take an analog of Sam Harris's morality, they would say, oh, there's another chimp, I shouldn't tear him to pieces. Maybe I'll tear apart the little monkeys in the trees and use them as a food source, but I won't tear apart another chimp. Well, what that is taking is humanism and reading it back onto chimp behavior. And what Sam is offended by and concerned by in terms of this chimp behavior is that chimps aren't acting like humans. So now we should ask the question, why did we come up with this pattern of saying we ought not to differentiate or kill people on the basis of them being in another group, even though we do it all the time? Because maybe I'll release this a day later, because just trying to pass things out for y'all so I don't clump them up too much, although next week there might not be a lot of videos, so just a little warning. What are the boundary lines between humans that we justify violence with? Why do we drone strike terrorists? Well, we use this word terrorist to separate them from human. And this is well known and broadly written about. Well, why did we kill Germans during World War II? Why did Germans kill Jews? Why did Japanese colonize Korea and China and many other places within their sphere? Why are those tags? Well, again, Alan Jacobs' book during World War II. Nationalism. Well, now we're talking about a fairly useful categorization. What's the critique that is pushing back on nationalism? Well, it says, well, these are all human beings. In fact, at the heart of this eliminate ICE and get rid of borders is this idea, well, they're all human beings. And so what separates an American from a Mexican? An arbitrary legal fiction. Well, is it arbitrary? Well, we try and make it non-arbitrary by having things like immigration laws and having things like, ideas of when my oldest son was born in the Dominican Republic, he was an American citizen. Why? Because my citizenship was inherited down to him, mine and my wife, down to my son, even though he was born in the Dominican Republic. When we hear Jordan Peterson's Goodall story, we are upset by chimp-on-chimp violence because we project same species respect back onto the chimp. But we would pardon chimp-on-snake violence. Why doesn't chimp-on-snake violence bother us while chimp-on-chimp violence does? Now, Sam Harris says we're trying to correct what we evolved to do. Why? Is this rational? I think it's rational for the chimps to monitor their borders and defend their territories, even against immigrants, as Jordan Peterson said. Chimp violence is rational. Well, was not this rationality and adaptation selected for survival and well-being? Now, can we call this rationality? Are the chimps operating rationally? Or is rationality itself something we are projecting back onto them? Now, what is rationality again? Well, I would assert rationality does not give us foundations. Rationality looks for consistency and processes that achieve outcomes. Chimps live in a certain space. They have a need for food. Too many chimps in a space would threaten their food supply and therefore their ongoing survival. What is rational is to monitor your territory and to exclude other chimps and limit the population so that you can maintain your food supply. We would call this a rational line of thinking. Now, chimps don't think this through rationally. They don't discuss it. And again, Peterson goes into this. But they do act it out. Well, why do they act it out? Where did they get this knowledge from? Did someone sit down and think about it? Well, this is a question. Was there a designer who designed this? Or was it a product of randomness? All right. And did the chimps at some point somehow figure out, and it got coded onto them, that they have to limit the population in an area to secure the food supply? Well, how are they going to do that? Well, they don't have uniforms, but they do smell, and they know who's in and who's out. And so then when another chimp comes in, they don't say, hey, wait a minute, this line here that we've all been peeing on and stuff, or however they mark their territory, this line here, this is our land. Go back and look at that artist that Jordan Peterson likes. This is our land. Sam Harris a little bit later will say, it's totally irrational, this fight in the Middle East. It's not un-chimp-like. It's not irrational for chimps. Chimps do it. Now we're getting back into 19th century arguments about rationality based on the animal kingdom. And most of us today would say, we don't want to go back to that moral system of eugenics and people. We want to say all people are the same. Really? What's the basis for this? Biology? People are not the same at all. LeBron James and I are not the same at all. And myself and a disabled child are not the same at all in terms of mental capacity, in terms of physical capacity, in terms of all kinds of capacity. And then with all of these amazing capacities we have as human beings, we put ourselves into these hierarchies. They're not the same at all. In fact, most of the people who ever lived in the world did not see the world this way. Well, Thomas Jefferson wrote it. Well, where'd Thomas Jefferson get it from? We got it from John Locke. Where'd John Locke get it from? The Bible. So Sam, if you want your religion-free clean room, I'm pretty sure humanism is on the outside of it. You're worried about sneaking Jesus in? You're bringing him in yourself in your flexible suitcase called humanism. We'll get to that in a minute. So, are there two types of rationality? Is there Darwinian rationality, that which is rational in order to promote species survival? Now, again, you've got a lot of implicit groupings, and if you go back and you take a look at The Metaphysical Club, which is Jordan Peterson's favorite book on the pragmatist that he keeps recommending, what is Darwinian's big move? Well, you recognize that these groupings are, well, what are they? How are they? In fact, grouping itself is an enormously difficult thing. And again, I have to attribute, a lot of what I've learned about this from Peterson. Grouping things is not easy. We tend to group things according to ourselves. We look around and we don't see objects, we see opportunities and obstacles. We tend to group things according to our desires. Donald Trump made a big deal about immigration. He sure likes marrying women from Europe, though. Maybe if he liked marrying Mexican women, we'd have stricter laws against Eastern European immigration. Here's the thing. Rationality is a tool that we use in order to achieve outcomes we want. Now, the monkeys aren't reasoning in the way we're reasoning to the degree that we know, but they are acting out things, and they are acting out groups. But now, Sam Harris wants to come along and say, well, then there's morality, and he wants his morality to be rational, so let's call it rational morality. That which is rational in order to promote a moral status according to some moral metric. But remember the project here. We're trying to find the basis for the moral metric, and we don't want it to be arbitrary. But Sam, all along the way, keeps using a basis for the moral metric in order to evaluate the process for creating a moral metric. It would be like using a yardstick in order to come up with a yardstick. You keep using this yardstick in all of your rationality to come up with the yardstick, and at some point you look and say, here it is. And someone would say, you started with the yardstick. Sam is starting with a yardstick. He's had a yardstick all along. You're worried about sneaking Jesus in? Well, that actually comes in the Dublin one. You're worried about sneaking Jesus in? You snuck your moral yardstick in. And now you're using your moral yardstick in order to defend and create a new yardstick. It's kind of like going to the lab and saying, I'm going to create life. But make sure you have a little bit of life in there so that the life goes. Because it's really hard to do it without any, which is exactly where they're at. Rational morality, that which is rational in order to promote a moral status according to some moral metric. Where does this moral metric come from? How distinct is it from Darwinian rationality? Sam Harris wants to say, we need a better moral yardstick than the chimps. Okay, where does this yardstick come from? Does it come from the chimps? You're saying we need it. You're saying we have it. What's its source? How can we know it? Now, Peterson's and many others are going to say there's continuation between Darwinian moral rationality. We can say, okay, well, we used to, just like tribes down in South America, kill any outsider we saw. They're doing just like the chimps did. And then we discovered, that's not a really effective way of what? Of growing our domain. In other words, your morality is pragmatic. It's pragmatic towards your Darwinian telos. Okay. All three in this conversation seem to share the idea that at some point for human beings, Darwinian rationality must give way to what they would call rational morality. And they imagine a progression. They seem to want to preserve the goal or telos of Darwinian rationality, but assert that new boundaries, rules, and practices are essential to transcend the old ones. Okay, are these via trial and error? Maybe. I'm not saying this is all wrong, but where does this moral rationality comes from? Observing. Now, Jordan Peterson would say observing. We don't get it from watching the chimps, though. We won't get it from reading ancient history. Sam's repeated complaint about sourcing the old. Well, I think you're going to have to source the old. But there's some chronological snobbery, and every time it says, what's so different about now than then? Well, what's so different about now than then is, as Jordan Peterson has been saying, we've been evolving these structures, and there's tons of things built in. And we can see the change in these structures. Maybe 150 years ago, if you were a white child born to a master on a plantation and you had a black servant, you could do what you want to your black servant. And this is practiced all kinds of ways overseas now. If you have a servant in the home, the children, we had domestic help when we lived in the Dominican Republic, and one of the issues that my wife and I really wrestled with is how do the children treat the domestic help? Because the Dominican woman who worked in our house had one frame of reference in order to imagine how that relationship would go. My wife and I had another frame of reference. Guess what we did? We imposed our frame of reference not only on our child, but on Angela, who worked in the house, in order to treat the child this way. This was not the frame of reference Angela came into the house with. Was that cultural imperialism? Yeah. If I were to describe to most of you, you would all agree with me and my wife that basically we instructed Angela to be an adult according to my child, and if my wife and I weren't around, and if she was babysitting and babysitting Philip, that Philip would obey her. And that was very easy for Philip to pick up. It was a little harder for her to pick up because she understood that there's a hierarchy involved. And the child of now we didn't own Angela, she wasn't our slave, she worked for money, but her job was very important to her because we tried to pay her better than average because we could, and she valued her job, and quite frankly, working for Americans was often a lot easier than working for Dominicans because we had all of these ideas, all of this morality, which was far beyond those of the chimps. Where you find a lot of these ideas is in the Bible. I'm not saying it's not in other places, but in the Bible, beginning in the Old Testament, hospitality to the sojourner. Well, you might say, wow, that's not as full-blown, but a little bit later, Jesus and Paul's radically transcending the Jewish ethno-nationalism. The entire journey of the New Testament is one of going from Jewish particularity, where the city of God is Jerusalem with the Jews ruling the world, to, at the end of the book of Revelation, a nation of every tribe and language with the Lord ruling the world. And with Jesus' brand of egalitarianism, Among you you shall have no masters, but you'll all be brothers and sisters. Well, gosh, where do we get these ideas from? Jesus. Sam sneaks Jesus into the story long before Jordan Peterson has a chance. Sam's whole point is to not look in the Bible, but Sam offers zero footnotes or even awareness of where he derives the foundation of his moral rationality. Human privilege over other animals. Well, for Sam, it frays at both ends. Euthanasia, abortion, are old dying people human beings? Should fetuses be afforded this status? When? How? Under what terms? All of the discussion about this is negotiating humanism, where humans are privileged above other animals. Now, you can have radicals out there who say, this humanism must go. Well, again, I was watching Joe Rogan and Elon Musk, and yeah, what happens when we can enhance a human being? Are they human? What is it to be human? Are these categories really so clear? And quite frankly, Sam, do you find them in nature at all apart from religion? My answer is no, you don't. You snuck Jesus in when you snuck your humanism in. You might say, well, there's other religions. Okay, your argument isn't just against Christianity, though, Sam. It's against all religion. Show me the rational basis for human privilege. And once you show it to me, and if you locate it or try to establish it on a foundation other than something like the Imago Dei, or as Jordan Peterson says, the spark of humanity, if you locate it in something like capacity, well, then we've got a justification for all kinds of things that we played with at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, that in the middle of the 20th century we decided it wasn't a good moral idea. But is all this just convention, changing over time? Projecting back bigotry against the heavenlies. Sam might say, we get this advancement in moral knowledge or rationality from great moral teachers like Jesus, but his appropriation is selective. We'll say, okay, we like Jesus refining our boundaries, and we like it when Jesus doesn't participate in the kind of nationalism where Jesus would automatically treat Romans as enemies. And when the Apostle Paul goes out and doesn't demand circumcision of Gentiles coming in the church and treats them instead like equals. This is egalitarianism. Where do we get it from? But then he says, but keep the Son of God talk to yourself. Okay, well, where's your complaint about arbitrary there? They both come from Jesus. Now, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson is at least willing to try to translate Son of God talk into a secularized ideas of hierarchy. Remember, he's an open agnostic. And in fact, when you watch Peterson treat the Bible, he's not saying, I'll steal the humanism and I'll sneak it into my moral yardstick and then use that basis to break the humanist canon by saying we need to transcend monkey morality. Jordan Peterson doesn't do that. He incorporates it and says, okay, well, let's say you're going to maintain your modern distinction between natural and supernatural, and you're not going to go there with the supernatural, and you want to keep everything from the bottom. You're going to say Son of God talk is talk about hierarchy, and God talk is talk about hierarchy. And it's not metaphysic, it's from the bottom, it's mythological. That's what Jordan Peterson is doing. And his system works, especially to the degree that, as Mouthy Buddha noted in his video that I mentioned a while ago, I think this is why he's stealing Sam Harris's audience. Sam Harris wants one and not the other. Why can't you trust Jesus to tell you it's morally noble to die for your enemies or your competing tribe? Because that's Sam's very Christian definition, it would seem. But not that there is a God in heaven who governs and makes moral demands on us. Rationality. And again, Jordan Peterson might say, well, that God in heaven language, well, what is that? Well, this is how human beings embody and appropriate these moral factors. Great. And this is why people can listen to that and say, I can live with that. But does it really finally address the question of source? And this is why I think we can understand Christianity from the top and the bottom and how they meet. Now let's say, well, the moral judgments of the Bible has all kinds of moral judgments we don't like. All three will regularly condemn passages in the Bible, and you'll hear this, and they're going to work on this a little bit, and they drag Peterson into it. But upon what moral basis is their condemnation? Again, they're bringing the moral yardstick and applying it to the Bible, and not recognizing how the Bible has contributed to the moral yardstick they're applying to the Bible itself. Now, and they keep linking it to time, which suggests that, they got it from a point in the past, and we all got it from a point in the past, and they're all using a standard found in one place in the book to critique other places in the book. Now you might say, aha, this shows that the Bible is corrupt. You see these books behind me? Especially before I made videos, having enough time to study the Bible since I've been talking to you all. But I'm in my 50s. I've had a few years to do this. What do pastors and theologians do? Do we say that the whole thing is the Word of God, or inspired, or infallible? Yeah. But what do we mean by that? Well, we understand that there's a conversation within the book, and that there are rules to the conversation within the book. And we're discussing this conversation within the book. Remember what Jordan Peterson sees at the top of the hierarchy? This gets practiced in the church, and it has for thousands of years. This is what we do, and we say, okay, so in the Old Testament you have this Hebrew and this Jewish particularity. The transition that happens in the New Testament is that there's much more of an egalitarian spirit, and it gets globalized, so that Romans can be children of God too, sons of God. Scythians can be sons of God. Greeks can be sons of God. Africans can be sons of God. Asians can be sons of God. Native Americans can be sons of God. Now, is this clean and does it go simply? No, there's conversation and struggle all along the way. But the moral yardstick that everyone in this room keeps applying is exactly that yardstick. They are all mirroring the development of Christianity. And Jordan Peterson just says it. Brett Weinstein, little unsure. Sam Harris denies it. It's just obvious to me that Sam Harris's yardstick that he believed he came up with in a clean room is not from a clean room at all. He smuggled Jesus. Now, what is the Bible? Many people assume that it is a flat book of rules and mandates that works like karma. The Bible says, oh, you do these things and you'll do well, and you don't do these things. Is there an aspect of the Bible like this? Yeah. But it really isn't how the Bible is written. And in fact, I remember as a college student, leaving, you leave home and you try to figure this stuff out for yourself, and you try and decide what you're going to be if you're going to continue to follow in the faith of your parents. And so you start thinking about this stuff. And one of the things that I realized that this, in a certain way, this evangelical faith that I saw, where the Bible should be clear on how to go to heaven. The more I read the Bible, the more I realized it's not really quite what the Bible's about. And that leads you to the question, well, what is the Bible about? Well, that should lead you to reading the Bible. And it's not entirely easy to figure out what the Bible is about just by reading it, because we have all of these filters that we read the Bible through, and this is natural. So what you do in the process is you keep working on it. You keep in conversation with books and others to figure out, well, what is this book really about? Well, the Bible is about justice. Okay, but that's complicated too. It's complicated in any way you go. Are you saying, Paul, that you don't believe that the Bible is has perspicuity? Now I'm talking to Christians in terms of code talk and theological code talk. No, I'm not denying that. The Bible is sufficiently clear to allow different cultures to come into a fruitful relationship with their Creator. There you go. That's what I believe. Now, how this gets worked out throughout the course of history in the myriad of different cultures that have handled the Bible is very messy and very complicated, and people get it wrong all the time because we are people. And as Jordan Peterson noted, this business about interpretation is a complicated one. And when people divinize their interpretation, they've often got a problem. But you can't help not do it because you have to set up a hierarchy in your mind, and we should follow through with what we believe. So, but as Peterson said, we should talk about it. We should work it through with each other. The Bible is far more complex than a flat book of rules stipulating rational ways to pursue outcomes. The Bible is the story of the world. The world begins with one human family, and that family fractured into near perpetual violence. We're like the chimps. Israel is an attempt to regain the lost world. Israel is to be the kingdom of God, to be the city of God. Jerusalem is to be the city of God, and it's a failure. It's a horrible failure. It's a bloody failure. Why? Because we can't do it. Jesus comes as the icon of the invisible God. He suffers, dies, rises. The Bible ends with a city made up of every tongue and nation, reconciliation with God and neighbor. That's the story of the Bible. And along the way, there's a whole lot in that book. Now, from here on in, Sam's going to touch the waters, and we're going to go into texts and talk about texts. And I don't have time to do that video today. As I said, next week Monday, I'm going to be in Fresno. And if you go to meetup.com and type Jordan Peterson Fresno Meetup, my friend's name. My friend Matt in Fresno is starting a meetup down there, and amongst some other friends who've been driving up to Sacramento. So we're going to inaugurate their meetup in a restaurant in Fresno next Monday night. And Tuesday, I've got to be in LA for some church work. So I'll probably not make any videos Monday and Tuesday. Maybe I'll make one Monday morning before I leave. So some of you are saying, I can't keep up with the videos. Well, there'll probably be some pauses for you to catch up with the videos, don't worry. But at some point, okay, so next Sam is going to derail us into, well, Sam touches the water in Mirkwood, and Sam and Jordan and Brett are going to be wandering around the forest for a little while.